Welcome to this CMP setup video. We're going to talk about packing the press and taping the rails. So this first part, what I'm doing is I'm actually setting up my paper wedge. I have this layered kind of wedge of torn graph paper, and what that does is it helps get the platen to that last little bit of level. I don't want to go on the back and mess with the bolts. It's really something that you should only do if you already have a lot of experience doing it. Once I have that taped down, I'm going to check my red board, which is shown here, and my tympan to make sure they're cut to pretty much the exact size of the platen. In this case, I'm also going to show my top sheet, and you'll notice this is a little bit longer, and what the top sheet is going to do is hold all of the packing against the platen. I cut my acetate top sheet to be just a little bit longer, and that way it can tuck under that bottom tympan bail. So here I'm taking a little bit of tape and attaching it to the bottom edge of the top sheet. And what that'll do is allow me to kind of work with it like a hinge. It will lift up the top sheet when I lift the top tympan bail so I can slip more packing underneath as needed. I really love to use an acetate top sheet because it protects that really expensive tympan paper behind it. It's also really easy to wipe off if you accidentally misprint onto it. So here you can see what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to tape down the sides, and I'm going to add a little tape tab to the top. So this tape tab is all I use to hold the top part of the top sheet down. And the reason I do that is I don't want it taped all the way down the top edge because it makes it hard to slip packing and make ready underneath. And here in the video, you'll notice that I'm having a little bit of trouble with the yellow tape because it's not sticky enough. So I'm actually going to use an artist tape. I like an artist tape because it doesn't leave a sticky residue behind, even if you're lifting it and putting it back down a lot of times. It's a little bit more expensive than the painter's tape, but I also use the blue painter's tape pretty often and find that that works great. I find taping down the sides just helps keep that top sheet flat. It's really curled right now because it comes off of like a large acetate roll, and I cut it down to size. Alright, so from this stage onward, you're just going to see me adjusting the tape a little bit and getting the perfect fit on both sides. Once that's done, all that I really have to do is check my tympan bails, make sure they're down nice and tight, and then slip my, my additional packing, so my red board and my tympan paper behind this top sheet. So you might be wondering, at what stage should I replace my packing? I personally am able to use my packing for many months before I actually need to replace it, and I generally only replace it when it starts to get like deep grooves or indentations that affect my print quality. I replace the top sheet more often than I replace the interior packing, but it's something that if you keep it really clean, you don't need to replace it too often. So one additional note is that this system of using the clear acetate top sheet works best if you're using compressible or removable gauge pins. You'll see me kind of place them on at the end here, but I actually make them out of foam tape and spare bits of photopolymer. I really like them because they're repositionable and I don't have to cut a slot into my top sheet, which I find makes you go through so much packing because you get all these little cuts and kind of abrasions in it, and that stuff can kind of show through the prints. So having this nice, smooth, easy to wipe off top sheet, I think just makes the whole printing process so much easier. One final advantage to this clear top sheet is that it's easy to see any make ready you need to place underneath. So if you need to like tear up bits of tissue paper or something to kind of adjust areas of your impression, it's really easy to kind of draw on top of this or see exactly where you need to place it. So you can see me kind of tearing up some graph paper here, and this is frequently how I would adjust little areas of impression when I'm actually in the print process. So I can see exactly where it is and make those adjustments by eye. And finally, the last thing you need to do is just stick on your gauge pins, and then you're ready to print. Now that I've finished replacing the packing, I'm ready to clean the rails off in preparation for some new tape. This is not something you're going to have to do very often. In fact, the only reason I'm replacing this tape after I think it's been on there for probably about 5 years is that during a print job, a chunk of it kind of came up and tried to wrap itself around the rollers, and so I think it's just been losing its stickiness over the years from all the press wash and stuff that goes over the press. So it's finally time for me to just bite the bullet, get it cleaned off, and repack the rails, so to speak. So once you've removed the tape, The next step is just to take a razor blade and scrape off any of that really thick, sticky residue that sometimes is left behind. After you've done that, you can come back with a rag and some mineral spirits and just really degrease the surface. Having it really nice and clean will make sure that the next layers of tape stick really well to the rails. Once you complete both sides, all you need to do is let it dry for a minute or two and prepare your other materials so that you're ready to move on to the next stage. So while the rails dry, I'm going to work on measuring the rail tape. I did my packing on these rails so many years ago that I honestly can't remember how many strips of tape I used. So this time I'm actually going to write it down. But my first step is to kind of try and get a guesstimate by using a pair of calipers to measure how thick the tape that I removed from the rails is. At that point, I can compare the thickness of this thick tape band to a single sheet of tape and do the math, or I can build up layers of tape and compare them until they're about the same thickness. So now what I can do is compare this measurement of the layered tape to a single thickness of tape and do the math. Or if you're kind of struggling with that, what you can do is just layer strips of tape and then compare the thicknesses with the calipers until you find out how many strips you need to match the original tape rails. And finally, make sure you're using the right tape. You want strapping tape, not electrical tape, not artist tape, not painter's tape. The long fibers in strapping tape make it resistant to compression and stretching, which is really important for taping your rails. Once your rails are dry and your tape is ready, it's time to start applying your tape to the rails. In my case, I knew about how much tape I needed, give or take 1 or 2 strips. If you don't have tape to compare to, then there's a different method that you're going to want to use. My suggestion would be to lock up a delicate form on press, so something with a little bit of typography or detail in it. Then you're going to want to add your rollers and ink to the press. Add tape strip by strip, waiting until you have enough tape that the form no longer inks up. In between each pass, you're going to want to wipe off the form. That way you'll see when that last strip of tape lifts the rollers high enough that it no longer inks the form. Then all you have to do is actually take tape off until you get a perfect inking. Obviously, you're not going to want to be running your motor for that. You're going to want to just rotate the press by hand, taking time to check the inking after each tape strip that you add to the press. It's definitely tedious, but if you keep track of how many tape strips you've added and removed, then you only really need to do this once. From that point on, you're going to know about how much tape you need. You may find that you have to add or remove tape for different jobs as well. If you're printing something really small, sometimes you need those rollers just a little bit higher. For that reason, I actually like to stagger the tape at the top so that it's easy for me to remove a strip if I need to. When I'm working on press and I just need to slightly adjust the tape, I do actually use painter's tape because it's easier to remove off of the strapping tape. This gives me the ability to adjust by little increments as needed. Generally, once I have my tape packing on the rails correct, I almost never have to change it. This is because the strapping tape is really resistant to stretching and compression. If you don't have the ability to tape the rails, there's one other option, and that's taping the trucks. So in my case, I've actually taped both the rails and the trucks. I'm not entirely sure why I did this. My assumption was that the electrical tape added a little bit of grip so that my rollers wouldn't slip, but I'm not sure if it really makes much of a difference. At this stage, I've just continued to leave the tape on the trucks because I know exactly how much both the rails and the trucks need to have perfect impression and inking with my photopolymer. Many printers will argue that one way is better than the other. I don't think it makes a huge difference. The only thing I found is that the electrical tape leaves a lot more residue. It doesn't tend to come off. It will stay on those trucks for years and years and years. But when you do have to remove it, you're going to have to wipe down the trucks with some mineral spirits and then take the time to scrape off any of that extra residue. This part of the video is quite obviously sped up, but just take your time making sure you get all the tape residue off. You don't want a bunch of lumps and bumps under your new tape if you're going to retape your trucks. One of the disadvantages to taping your trucks is that it's really hard to know how many layers you've added because they're circular. With the rails, it's easy to count your layers, but with this, it's kind of hard to know when you've overlapped that first edge. In this case, I'm just going to use the tape that was already on the rails as my measurement for the new tape that I'm going to add. It was about maybe 1 full revolution around the truck. Now you could probably use strapping tape for this, but I ended up using electrical tape because I felt the rubbery surface was going to grip along the strapping tape that's already on the rails a lot better. This sort of stretchiness that you see with the electrical tape is an advantage when it comes to wrapping this circular shape and getting it nice and smooth, but it does not work well on the rails. When I tried to use it on the rails, it would pull itself off. It just did not have the ability to grip, and the stretching caused it to kind of wrinkle up and sort of bunch in on itself. Finally, I can just trim any excess, and the newly taped trucks are ready to go back on press. The last stage is oiling the press. This is a really important part of maintenance because if you keep your machine well oiled, it's going to last for another 200, 300 years. Although these machines are heavy and really sturdily built, they're quite delicate. Anytime you have moving parts, you want to make sure there's some form of grease or oil on them. For the gears, it's generally grease, but anytime you see an oiling port, you want to add oil. One trick is to take a little bit of red enamel paint or nail polish and paint around the oiling port so that you can find them. I've found sometimes that I will go years and find an oiling port that I had completely forgotten about. So you want to make sure that they're visible and that you're re-oiling your machine every few press runs. It's really not something you can overdo. The oil is going to make sure that any of the parts are not rubbing and grinding away the metal, which can cause major issues later when things don't line up correctly and you have trouble printing. So after you've finished oiling, everything is greased. So now that the press has been repacked, the rails are fixed, and the machine is oiled, it's ready to print. I hope this video was helpful. If there's something you'd like to see in the future, let me know in the comments, and happy printing!